deputy governor, left the bank to become chairman of Canadian National Railways. James Coyne was appointed in the number 2 position at the bank on that occasion. The second came in November 1954, when Graham Towers was about to retire after 19 years as governor. Coyne was appointed to be next governor, effective January 1st, 1955, with Lou again passed over. And the third came at the same time, when Robert Beattie was appointed to be number 2 to Coyne, or senior deputy governor, a position that might well have gone to Lou. Lou was promoted to the newly created position of deputy governor in January 1955. There was considerable speculation that anti-Semitism had played an important role in Lou's not receiving one of the 2 top positions. For example, an article in the Canadian Jewish News in the issue following Lou's appointment in 1961 quoted Dr. J.J. McCann, a minister in the King and Saint Laurent governments, as having said in 1954, when he was first passed over, if his name had been Smith or Jones or perhaps even Richard, he probably would have got the job. The same issue of the Canadian Jewish News carried the headline, Ottawa Spurns Bigots. It is worth noting, as shown in PCO records, that the Conservative cabinet under John Diefenbaker had taken the position around the time of Lou's appointment that it would, quote, not be influenced by the possibility of criticism by anti-Semitic groups. More on this later from Michael Rasminsky. Among other noteworthy developments in the years before he was appointed governor, Lou was an advisor on the establishment of the Bank of Israel, received an honorary doctorate from the University of Toronto, and was discussed as a possible deputy managing director of the IMF. In sum, his focus over the period between the end of the war and 1961 was largely on international affairs. Although he had been promoted to deputy governor in 1955, it seemed unlikely that he would achieve a higher position at the bank. All that changed as a result of what came to be known as the Coyne Affair. Coyne, remember, is the governor appointed in January 1st, 1955. Now we're getting to 1961, but we'll go over what happened in the late 1950s. There were significant differences in views in the later 1950s and early 1960s between the government of Canada under John Diefenbaker and the Bank of Canada under James Coyne. The government was more concerned about insufficient demand and unemployment, while the bank was more focused on the increasing inflationary pressures and their longer-term implications for the economy. These differences resulted in public disagreements. In this context, the government took the position put forward by the Minister of Finance, Donald Fleming, that monetary policy was not the responsibility of the government. Rather, he asserted, the responsibility for monetary policy was entirely in the hands of the Bank of Canada. In addition, as governor, Coyne involved the bank in disputes with the government by taking positions that went further into the political domain than was typical of central banks. These included areas such as foreign investment in Canada, and foreign ownership of Canadian companies, where he took a very nationalistic position. Strangely enough, the particular issue on which the battle finally rested in the political domain was a technical one regarding the governor's pension. But this was a political sideshow compared to the substantive differences over monetary policy and other issues. In the event, the House of Commons passed a bill declaring the office of the governor of the Bank of Canada vacant. Coyne testified before the Senate, which rejected the bill, and then immediately resigned. The government then approached Lou to take on the position of governor. From the government's perspective, Lou had 2 notable advantages. First was the international recognition of his great ability. This was particularly important at a time when the domestic and international reputation of the bank was at a low point as a result of the Coyne Affair. The second was they had not been implicated in the battle between the government and the bank because they'd been largely involved in international affairs over the recent years. But before Lou was prepared to accept the position of governor, he wanted an agreed and explicit understanding with the government of the respective roles of the government and the central bank in the monetary policy area. This understanding, which was incorporated into the Bank of Canada Act in 1967, was sometimes referred to as joint or dual responsibility. According to this view, ultimate responsibility for monetary policy was in the hands of the government. But if there was no fundamental difference in views, the bank had independence in implementing policy. Furthermore, if there should be a fundamental difference of views with respect to monetary policy, there was to be a formal arrangement in which the government could give an explicit directive to the bank instructing it on how to proceed. But that directive would have to be made public, and in such circumstances, the governor, having lost the confidence of the government, would almost certainly resign. Also, Lou believed that it was essential for the Minister of Finance and the Governor to meet on a regular basis, and this too was agreed. That was because the previous Minister of Finance and James Coyne did not meet very frequently. What was central to the arrangements proposed by Lou was that the government would be required to make its reasoning for a directive to the bank public, explicit and very public. And that would make it very difficult for a government to exert pressure on the bank for partisan political reasons. Interestingly, in the 56 years since this agreement on the relationship between the government and the bank came into effect, no such directive has ever been given by the government to the Bank of Canada. I once asked Lou where this particular formulation of the idea of joint responsibility for monetary policy had come from. He smiled and made it clear that it was his own idea. In a letter to the Globe and Mail in the mid-1970s, he explained that the agreement was a formalization of what had been the intent of the government beginning in 1935, when the Bank of Canada was established, and that the Fleming-Coyne controversy had been an aberration, and the new arrangements had restored what implicitly had been the case earlier. Lou's belief in the de facto independence of the Bank of Canada, not the de jure independence, but the de facto independence in the absence of a fundamental disagreement, in ordinary times, in other words, is illustrated by an episode recounted by Peter Newman in Volume 1 of his book, The Canadian Establishment. It took place at a Canadian Bankers Association dinner in the early 1960s. Walter Gordon, then Minister of Finance, spoke first and ended his talk with the outspoken thought, well, we'll listen to you, Louis, but I'm so plainly right, it's only a courtesy after all. Not very nice. Lou stood up, elegant as always, waited for the room to become completely quiet, and said he would tell a story, which he felt was all he needed to say in reply to the Honourable Minister. Lou had just returned from Europe and had been discussing with the governor of the Bank of France, the relationship of the central bank with governments and cabinets. The French governor had said to Louis, we practice a fine profession. In assessing its merits, it might bear remembering that in the years I've been governor of the Bank of France, I've seen 22 ministers of finance come and go. With that, Lou bowed to Walter Gordon and sat down. Lou was appointed governor of the Bank of Canada on July 24th, 1961, 56 years ago tomorrow. Reappointed for a second term on July 24th, 1968. He retired on his 65th birthday on February 1st, 1973, about 4.5 years into his second term, as a result of the ill health of his wife, Lila. When Lou was appointed governor, he became an icon for the Canadian Jewish community. The issue of the Canadian Jewish News reporting on his appointment had a front page article, an editorial, and a background article devoted to the story. The newspaper focused considerable attention on the breakthrough element of Lou's appointment, noting that Rasminsky's appointment is a revolutionary occurrence. His appointment now is in line with Prime Minister Diefenbaker's Bill of Rights that there should be no discrimination because of race, creed, or color. As reported in the Ottawa Jewish Bulletin a little bit later, a testimonial plaque given to Lou at a communal reception honoring him and his wife at the Ottawa Jewish Community Centre, not this building, but the old building, on September 6, 1961, read as follows. In tribute to Louis Rasminsky, distinguished public servant, whose life has been dedicated to the service of his country and fellow man, and recognition of his appointment as Governor of the Bank of Canada, which does honor to him and all Canadian Jewry. The Jewish community of Ottawa, assembled the 6th day of September 1961, records its pride and affection and extends its warmest wishes to him and his family for every happiness and success. See how the relationship of the community to Lou was. I particularly remember my father, an immigrant from Canada from Poland, marveling at the fact that a Jew could reach such a high position in Canadian officialdom. My father was particularly impressed by the fact that not only was Lou Jewish, but he was well known to be Jewish and was actively Jewish. My father also knew he governed the Beth Shalom, but I never figured out how he knew that. As Professor Howard Edelman later wrote, in Canada, anti-Semitism had not just been the prerogative of extremist right-wing nationalists, but permeated the intellectual, professional, and political establishment. However, when I was in graduate school, Louis Rasminsky's signature would appear on every Canadian dollar bill as he served as Governor of the Bank of Canada. The times they were changing. On the panel, right. With the elevation of Lou to the governorship in 1961 and other Jews to higher position in the later 1960s, and with the changing economic situation in Canada, The Jewish community in 1970 differed fundamentally from the same community as existed in 1960. Harold Tropers noted that when the doors opened, Jews who chose to pass through no longer had to park their Jewishness at the door as earlier generations had been forced to do. Suddenly, Jewishness was not something to hide. After Lou became governor, there was a period of confidence rebuilding at the Bank of Canada, both internally within the bank itself and externally in terms of the reputation of the institution. Also, given Lou's own experience and expertise was largely international, he now had to develop an equivalent competence in domestic monetary policy, which involved a fairly steep learning curve. Among the internal changes that were instituted at the bank was the division of the old research department into 3 analytical policy departments: international, monetary and financial, and domestic research. There was more decentralization in the bank's operations. The bank began publication of staff studies, introduced formal economic forecasting, and made an increasing use of econometrics. Large-scale model building was also introduced. There were French lessons for staff and initiatives to increase the number of francophones and women in the bank. As Lou's successor as governor, Jerry Bowie, put it, through his various initiatives, Lou infused the bank with new life. People all had a view of what the bank was there for and what its objective was in a way that, I think, this is Jerry talking, we never had under Cohen. More on this later from Gordon Thiessen about working at the bank under Lou. In October 1961, the government appointed a Royal Commission on Banking and Finance, popularly known as the Porter Commission, after its chair. Its mandate was, among other things, to examine and make recommendations for the improvement of the structure and methods of operation of the Canadian financial system, including the banking and monetary system. The intensive discussions in the bank leading up to the preparations of the bank's written position and of Lou's presentation to the Porter Commission helped Lou and the bank in a number of ways. Many meetings were held with give-and-take discussions, and Lou worked shoulder to shoulder with other bank officials, during which documents were prepared. Another quote from Jerry Bowie, Lou's successor: "It was a great educational process for all of us, including the new governor." Given the tension between the economists and the research department and James Coyne, this must have been like a breath of fresh air in the institution. And the view that the new governor could be convinced by logical arguments and would not dismiss weak, respectable intellectual argument put forward by an official soon spread throughout the bank. The Porter Commission